and I moved to a small Massachusetts town when I was 7 years old. My father had just upped and left a few weeks prior, so it was a difficult time for me. He had accepted a better position elsewhere, according to my mother. She assured me that Dad still cared for and cherished me, but even at that little age, I knew that he had abandoned us. I started at my new school on October 25th, during Halloween week. I insisted on walking there by myself because I was an obstinate 7-year-old. My mother scowled, gave it some thinking, and eventually agreed, but with a catch. Okay, as long as we go the trail together each evening before classes begin and you agree to stay on it. It wouldn't be far because she acquired a tiny 2-bedroom home less than a mile from my school. It was a cute small cottage, but I suppose nothing could really feel like home with my father gone. We went on a walk into the woodland behind our house the evening before I started school. Despite the sun beginning to set, the walkway was well lit. What a lovely way to get to school. This house was still available, can you believe it? She spoke. Despite not speaking, I nodded. You know, we used to have family here. I absolutely enjoy being here, my mother responded with a smile. I entered the kitchen the following morning and was welcomed with pancakes and a friendly smile. My mother must have seen that I was tense as I sat down to eat because she sat down next to me. You'll make friends here, so don't worry. I feel fantastic, she declared. Looking back, I find it difficult to comprehend how she was able to remain so strong after her husband left her. I really wish I had some of her fortitude. I proceeded down the trail as we had rehearsed doing it every evening. A tall teacher with large glasses welcomed me at the door and guided me into the classroom when I first got to the school. I sat down with the other 10 students, and the teacher started talking about the year ahead and what we would learn. Nobody was intentionally cruel to me, but nobody really spoke to me either. The other children hardly even noticed a new child was present because they were all preoccupied with discussing their Halloween costumes. However, there was one young girl who made a greeting. She sat 2 rows behind the other kids, so I assumed that she might be a new student at the school as well. She had brown hair, glasses, and was quite attractive. When I turned to look at her, she caught my eye and grinned broadly. She was so attractive that it was difficult for me to smile back, even if I tried. I tried to listen to the teacher when I turned around, but all I could think about was her. At 3:30, school was out for the day. I quickly grabbed my suitcase and ran outside in the direction of my house, eager to get home and tell my mother about the lovely girl who had smiled at me. I was making my way home quickly when I suddenly tripped over something and crashed to the ground, hurting my knee. I got to my feet to assess my wound and turned to see what had caused me to trip. The largest crow I have ever seen appeared. What was strange about its eyes, too? I heard someone behind me as I moved up close to study it. She said, "Hello, I remember you from school." I was surprised to see the attractive classmate when I swiftly looked up. I was mortified and quickly climbed to my feet, wondering if she had seen me fall. Even though my knee was hurting quite a bit, I was more concerned with how I seemed to her. Yeah, I believe I saw you in class today. Danny is my name, I declared. I'm Rosie, she retorted, grinning in return. Together, we took the trail south. How is your leg? She inquired. I tried to sound tough by saying, "Oh, it's okay." You reside here as well, huh? She informed me that she had a trail leading through the forest behind her house that led to the school and that her family had resided in this town for a while. We became fast friends. She shocked me by asking if she could see how my house looked as we approached it. You made such a good job on it. I grinned immediately and rapped on my front door. My mother spoke up, looking shocked to see Rosie standing next to me. Well, you don't waste time making friends, do you, Jim? She added with a smile. Will you formally introduce the young woman or will you remain silent? This is Rosie, I murmured, my face turning scarlet. She lives nearby and we met today at school. I tried to maintain my composure while acting excited. I answered, she wants to come over. Greetings, ma'am, I was curious to view your home. My family also resides in this area, Rosie chuckled. Enter quickly, sweetheart. My mother responded, "I just finished baking a batch of cookies." The three of us were chatting at the kitchen table when we brought up Halloween. My mother questioned, "What are you dressing as, Rosie?" "This year, I'm going to dress as a witch." "I've heard they're terrifying," remarked Rosie. "Witches are not dangerous." I spoke hurriedly. "Well, I was going to attend as a witch, but my family is out of town this weekend and I don't really have a place to stay yet," Rosie amended herself, smiling once again. "They said that I was too young to travel with them on their business vacation. They requested my regular nanny, but she became ill yesterday, so now." My mother cut her off. "You are more than welcome to stay with us over the weekend and go trick-or-treating with us if your parents are okay with it." I recognized right then and there that my mother was, in fact, the best mother in the entire world. "Jim, what do you think?" Mom asked while trying to hide her smile. "Yes, that is a fantastic concept," I said. My mother drove Rosie home to meet her parents and request their approval for her to spend the weekend at our house. I inquired about it with my mother when she arrived home. My mother exclaimed, "It went great. I believe that her mother and aunt look after her. Down the trail, they reside in a charming small cottage. They welcomed me inside, and we had a lengthy conversation. They both felt it was a brilliant idea. Though I do have a query. You must have a crush on this chick." Pretending I hurriedly crossed the room to my room and shut the door because I didn't hear her. "Do your homework," I said. "I love you," feeling a bit ashamed. I attempted to sleep that night, but I was too thrilled for Halloween. I had only been off a short while when I already had a friend. It was going to be a fantastic weekend. I started to notice something in the corner of my room as I considered how this might actually be a fresh start. I initially believed I was dreaming, but eventually my eyes started to focus. A tall man with long, dark hair and a gray beard was there. He had intense, piercing eyes. They fixed their unwavering gaze on the window. My entire body began to shake with fright. I ducked beneath the covers, like it wasn't happening, and hoped he hadn't noticed. I nearly yelled in fright when I peeked out from under. He was simply floating there while wielding an enormous axe that appeared to be covered in blood. I felt frozen and wanted to scream and flee the room. I was unable to speak. I'm not sure how I went to sleep, but when I woke up the following morning, he was gone, and it was as if nothing had ever occurred. I wanted to tell my mother, but for some reason I simply couldn't. I have no idea why. The week passed fast, but every evening the man in my room would come back, always carrying the big axe. He would occasionally just stare out the window while pacing back and forth on other evenings. His mouth moved, but he didn't say anything. The night before Halloween, after much terror and astonishment, he finally turned his head and looked at me. He looked directly into my eyes and moved forward. I began to tremble with panic as I pulled the blankets over my head. Was this actually happening? Was I nuts, or what? On Halloween, I almost told Rosie about the man who was staying at my place. I felt bad for not telling her because this weekend was the only thing I had been joyful about in a while, and I was afraid she would think I was crazy or something. That evening, Rosie and I visited various residences. I made an effort to enjoy myself, but I couldn't help but wonder what would transpire when she spent the night at my house. Was the man going to return? Will he spot her? I pretended there was nothing wrong when she inquired what was wrong. When we returned home, my mother had set up a sleeping area for us in the living room. I had a blanket put out on the floor and Rosie was going to sleep on the couch. We exchanged chocolates while expressing our shared fatigue. We were instructed to wake up my mother, who was dozing in the adjacent room, if we needed anything at all. Rosie and I went to bed that night as the wind began to roar against the windows. I convinced myself that since I had never seen the man outside of my room, we would be safe in this location. Although I felt bad, having a friend with me at night was simply so pleasant. I was unable to confront him again by myself. The storm grew louder and louder as midnight approached. I was growing increasingly sleepy while gazing up at the ceiling when I heard Rosie inquire, "Danny, are you awake?" I said, "I'm up." I'm unable to sleep since it's cold. Does anyone else have a blanket? She inquired. When I realized what I had just said, I froze after telling her I had one in my room. I'd have to return to my room. I knocked on my mother's door for a blanket in an effort to find some other solution, but she didn't answer. Even knocking failed to wake her up because the storm was so loud. I considered screaming her name, but then I remembered how silly I would appear to Rosie if I did. She inquired once more, "Didn't you say you had a blanket in your room?" I answered after taking a long breath, "Yes, I'll grab it for you." I cautiously opened the door and found no evidence of a monster or ghost. I swiftly rushed over to the distant closet to locate the spare blanket while holding my breath. I halted as I heard the door close behind me as I rummaged through my clothing. Now that the wind was almost shaking the house, it took all of my confidence to turn around. However, there was no ghost. There was only Rosie. I remarked, "Oh, it's just you." "Who were you expecting, the boogeyman?" Rosie asked with a smile. It was at that point that I realized she seemed strange. I saw she was significantly taller than she had been previously as she closed the door behind her. My room was fairly dark with the door closed, but were her eyes red? I thought I saw two tiny red spots where her eyes should have been, peering back. She chuckled and continued, "You shouldn't have let me in, Danny," in a gentle voice. "Rosie?" "It's not funny," I said. She remarked, "I find it extremely humorous." I noticed she had a huge knife in her hand as she moved across the room. What had once been a stunning young woman with a dazzling grin was now an aged, haggard-looking woman as the moon beamed across her face. She inquired, "Want a cuddle, Danny?" I ran into the room's corner and yelled for my mother. "Danny, she can't hear you." "You won't get through to her," stated Rosie. I was stuck with nowhere to go but watch her inch closer. I was unable to move because I was so terrified. I was left with no choice but to watch as she held the blade above her head and grinned menacingly. I will always remember what happened after that. Before she could lower the knife, she noticed something. She leaned back in terror as she turned to face the window. He halted her as she yelled and fell on the ground while desperately attempting to flee. The tall man struck her neck with the axe while still holding her in his one hand. She screamed in pain and terror, her neck now partially severed as she continued to attempt to crawl away. He trapped her to the ground by stomping firmly on her back. Then, using both hands to bring the axe down forcefully, he nearly completely severed her neck. A powerful tug was followed by a gruesome ripping sound. As the man totally lifted her head off her body, I heard a terrible pop. I was left with no choice but to observe as he opened the window and dragged her body and head into the woods. Stunned, I peered about. I just stood there and watched till he fully vanished despite the fact that I could hardly see. My mother wasn't responding when I called her name to try to wake her up. I went back to my room and remained by the window after making sure she was secure. I believe I was shocked in some way. I eventually heard her door open. I ran over to her and gave her a tight hug. "Happy morning. Did you two enjoy yourselves last night?" she inquired, as if she had not heard anything. Unable to express myself, I simply nodded slowly. "Tell Rosie to come back in 2 shakes for breakfast." My mother questioned, "Is she still asleep on the couch?" "Ooh," I said in response, adding that her mother had already picked her up. My mom then started making breakfast in the kitchen. If her parents really did come to get her, I wondered what I would say. If her parents were human, which is quite doubtful, they would probably be relieved that she was gone. The beginning of a new chapter in my life began that year. I was now aware that demons, witches, ghosts, terrible entities, etc., were not the stuff of fairy tales but actually existed. Now that I'm older, I also have my own family. I haven't mentioned any of this to my wife since my son was born a few months ago. I've never managed to time it quite right to inform her. One final point. When I was a child, my mother had sat down next to me and pulled out a photo album a few days after Halloween. I observed her casually flipping through the pictures before I intervened. I questioned, "Who is that man?" "Him? Your great-grandfather is that," she said. I focused on the image. He was there. The next night, I slept better. He continued to occasionally be seen gazing out my window into the night. I knew Rosie wouldn't be the last horrible thing I encountered, and I was also concerned about my kid, who was just a baby. I'm standing over my son's crib on Halloween night, gazing out into the shadowy woodland beyond. They know nothing, but I can feel something approaching for us. We're not on our own.